On June 14, 1969, a 6-year-old boy named Dennis Lloyd Martin disappeared from the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. He was playing a game with other children near Spence Field, a high meadow at about 5,000 feet. The children were hiding behind bushes, jumping out to surprise their parents. Dennis stepped behind a bush. He never stepped back out. 5 minutes passed before his father William realized something was wrong. Within hours, what would become the largest search operation in the history of the national park was underway. Over the next 2 weeks, more than 1,400 searchers combed the surrounding wilderness. Green Berets from Fort Bragg were brought in. FBI agents were deployed. Helicopters swept the canopy. Tracking dogs were sent into every drainage within a 10-mile radius. They found nothing. No clothing, no remains. No tracks beyond the initial area. Dennis Lloyd Martin was never found. But there was a detail that was recorded and then quietly set aside. A tourist from Knoxville named Harold Key reported to park rangers that on the afternoon of Dennis's disappearance, he had seen a rough-looking man moving along the tree line near the area where the boy was last seen. The man was carrying something on his shoulder. Key described the figure as unkempt, wild in appearance, and moving through thick undergrowth at a speed that struck him as unnatural. He said the shape on the man's shoulder was consistent with a small child. His report was filed. It was never followed up on publicly. The FBI took the case and classified portions of their investigation. 57 years later, those files have never been released. The Great Smoky Mountains sit on top of one of the most extensive cave systems in the eastern United States. Hundreds of documented entrances, thousands of feet of unmapped passage extending beneath the ridges and hollows of the most visited national park in America. The Cherokee had specific names for these cave systems. Some of them translate loosely to the places where people go and do not return. Today, I want to talk about something that most people in this space treat as internet folklore. Feral people. Humans who went into the wilderness and never came back. Humans who adapted to underground life, who lost language, who changed over generations into something that most of us would not immediately recognize as human. This is not a cryptid story. There are no monsters in this video. What there is science, documented history, indigenous oral traditions that stretch back centuries, and a pattern of institutional silence that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. You will not want to miss this one. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Thanks. To understand what we are dealing with, you need to understand the scale of what sits beneath the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachian mountain chain runs roughly 2,000 miles from Alabama to Maine. Beneath it lies the densest concentration of cave systems in the United States. Over 50,000 documented caves exist in the region. Thousands more have never been mapped. Some of these systems extend for miles underground, with passages that connect across county lines, across state lines, in networks that have never been fully explored. The conditions inside these caves are remarkably stable. Year-round temperatures hold steady between 55 and 60 degrees, regardless of the season above. Fresh water flows through many of them. The darkness is absolute, but the environment is constant. In ecological terms, a cave system is one of the most stable habitats on Earth. If you needed a place to survive without being found, you would be hard-pressed to find a better option anywhere on this continent. The people who go deepest into these systems are cave survey teams. These are volunteers and professionals who map unmapped passages, who squeeze through gaps that have never seen a headlamp, who document what exists in sections of the underground that no one else visits. They are the only human beings who regularly enter the deep sections of these cave systems. They see things that no one else sees. and for decades, many of them have stayed quiet about what they have found. In 1877, a party of gold miners traveling through the Globe Valley in Caldwell County, North Carolina, encountered what they described in the newspapers of the time as a wild man. They were moving through a remote section of the mountains when they spotted a figure watching them from the tree line. The miners reported that the man appeared to be roughly 6 feet 5 inches tall. His body was covered in dark hair approximately 2 inches long. When the figure realized it had been spotted, it pounded on its chest and bounded into the forest with what the miners described as the speed of a deer. They tracked it with guns drawn to a cave deep in the mountains. Inside, they found the bones of many animals scattered across the floor, stripped clean and piled in a way that indicated the cave had been occupied for a significant period of time. This was not a brief shelter. Someone had been living there. That account was published in period newspapers and is documented in the archives of the Southern Highlander Project. It is one of hundreds of similar reports from across Appalachia during the post-Civil War era. Wild men were spotted near cave entrances. Figures moved on all fours through dense brush. Vocalizations were heard from underground that sounded human, but lacked any recognizable language. In the 19th century, these accounts were treated as curiosities. Today, we have a framework for understanding what they might actually represent. But 1877 is a long time ago, so let me bring this forward. In the years since organized cave surveying became widespread in the mid-20th century, teams working in Appalachian cave systems have periodically reported finding evidence of sustained human habitation in sections of caves that are far too deep and far too remote for casual human access. Fire pits with cold ash but no soot trail leading to the surface. Bone piles consisting of small game, raccoons, possums, squirrels, stripped clean and stacked in organized rows against the cave walls. Scratch marks on the stone at heights between 5 and 7 feet. Tool marks made by sharpened stone, not metal. And in multiple separate cave systems, the same distinctive construction. Circular platforms made of stripped bark, woven tightly and lined with animal hide. Nests, human-sized nests built in total darkness, hundreds of feet from the nearest entrance. These were not transient camps left behind by hikers who wandered too far. There are no hiking trails within miles of these locations. The passages leading to them are too narrow and too technical for anyone without caving experience and equipment. These were dwelling sites, permanent ones, built by people who knew the cave systems intimately, who had adapted their lives to the underground, and who had been living there long enough to establish routines of habitation that left physical evidence in the stone. And here is where this takes a turn that I did not expect when I started researching. When this kind of evidence has been found in cave systems on federal land, the institutional response has followed the same pattern every single time. The entrance is sealed. The survey data is reclassified or removed from public databases. The official reason is always one of three things: structural instability, bat conservation under the white nose syndrome protocol, or general liability concerns. No investigation is opened, no law enforcement is contacted. The people who found the evidence are quietly told not to discuss their findings publicly, and the cave is closed. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Physical evidence of human beings living underground in federally managed cave systems is found, documented, and reported to the agencies responsible for managing that land. And the response is not to investigate. The response is to seal the entrance and classify the data. That is not how you respond to a structural concern. That is how you respond to something you do not want the public to know about. So who are these people? Where did they come from? And this is where it gets genuinely unsettling, because there is a plausible historical answer. During the Great Depression, entire communities in Appalachia lost everything. Homes, land, livelihoods, all of it gone. Some families retreated deeper into the mountains, into the hollows and gaps where the government could not follow them. This is not speculation. It is documented in WPA oral history projects from the 1930s and 1940s, where interviewers recording stories from mountain communities wrote down accounts of neighbors who packed up their families and walked into the backcountry and never came back. Local oral traditions in parts of eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, and western North Carolina describe these families as people who went into the hollows. Some of those families were seen periodically through the 1940s, the 1950s, even into the 1960s. Glimpses at the edges of cleared land, figures spotted near cave entrances at dusk, livestock taken in the night from farms that bordered national forest land. And then, gradually, the sightings became less frequent, not because the people had left, but because each generation moved further from the surface, further from the roads, further from anything that connected them to the world they had abandoned. If those families survived, and the evidence says that some of them did, then their children were born in isolation. Those children grew up without schools, without socialization beyond their immediate family unit, without language input beyond whatever fragmentary speech their parents could provide in conditions of extreme deprivation. And if those children had children of their own, deep in the cave systems and hollows of the Appalachian backcountry, then by now we are looking at the third or fourth generation. People whose connection to the society their great-grandparents left has been completely severed, not by choice, by time. That is not a wild man. That is not a cryptid. That is a human being whose family has been living outside of organized society for 90 years. And the difference between that person and you is not species. It is not biology. It is environment. It is what happens to a human mind and body when every generation is raised further from civilization than the one before. I want to share an account now. This comes from a man I will call Ray. He's been caving in West Virginia for over 15 years. He is an experienced surveyor who has logged hundreds of hours underground. In 2021, he was part of a small team mapping an unmapped lateral passage in a cave system in the eastern part of the state. The passage was tight, requiring them to crawl on their stomachs for roughly 200 feet before it opened into a chamber about 40 feet across. The chamber was approximately 1,200 feet from the nearest entrance. No natural light reached it. The air was still and cold. When Ray swept his headlamp across the walls, he saw scratches, deliberate marks cut into the limestone at about 6 feet off the floor. They were evenly spaced, roughly an inch apart, running in rows across the wall. He counted them. There were over 400 individual marks. Whatever had made them had been doing it for a long time. Against one wall, he found a fire pit, flat stones arranged in a circle with cold ash inside. Beside it, animal bones stacked neatly against the rock. Small game, raccoon skulls, possum vertebrae, all stripped clean. On the far side of the chamber, he found something that made him stop moving entirely. A nest, bark stripped from what he believed was tulip poplar, woven into a circular platform roughly 5 feet across, lined with what appeared to be deer hide. It smelled like sweat and decay and something alive. He was photographing the nest when he heard something deeper in the passage. Not an animal sound, a vocalization. Low, guttural, rhythmic. It rose and fell in a pattern that sounded deliberate, almost like speech, but without any recognizable words. Just sounds. Sounds that a human throat would make if it had never been taught to form language. Ray turned off his headlamp. In the absolute darkness, he could hear breathing, slow and controlled, close enough that he felt the air move against his face. He did not stay. He and his team left the chamber and exited the cave. Ray reported what he had found to the local Forest Service office. Within a week, the cave was closed to all survey teams. The reason given was white nose syndrome bat conservation protocol. Ray checked the survey records. There are no significant bat colonies documented in that section of the cave system. He has never been allowed back. I want to be clear about something. Ray is not a conspiracy theorist. He is not someone who sees monsters in shadows. He is a meticulous, experienced caver who has spent his career documenting what exists underground. When he tells me what he found in that chamber, he does not use dramatic language. He states the facts. And the facts are these. Someone is living in that cave. Someone who has been living there long enough to build permanent dwelling structures, to establish routines, and to leave 400 tally marks on the wall. And when that evidence was reported to the federal agency responsible for managing the land, their response was not to investigate. It was to seal the entrance and make sure no one else could get in. If this were an isolated case, an anomaly, a single strange finding in one cave in one state, you could dismiss it. But the more I dug into this, the more I realized that what Ray found in West Virginia is not unusual. It is not even rare. The same evidence, the same institutional response has been documented across cave systems in at least 4 states. And the deeper you look, the wider this thing gets. The United States contains over 45,000 documented caves. The actual number, including undiscovered and unmapped systems, is estimated to exceed 100,000. The Mammoth Cave System in Kentucky alone extends over 420 miles of mapped passage, making it the longest known cave system in the world. Lechugilla Cave in New Mexico stretches more than 150 miles. The Jewel Cave System in South Dakota is over 210 miles. These are not holes in the ground. These are underground networks vast enough to contain entire ecosystems, rivers, lakes, species that exist nowhere else on Earth. A person or a community of people could live inside these systems indefinitely without being discovered. The infrastructure for survival is already there. Constant temperature, fresh water, darkness so complete that detection from above is physically impossible. In 2012, a researcher named David Paulides published a series of maps showing clusters of unexplained disappearances in national parks and national forests. When independent analysts overlaid those clusters onto maps of known cave systems, the correlation was hard to ignore. The densest concentrations of unexplained disappearances sit directly on top of the densest concentrations of cave entrances. Now, I want to be fair here. Correlation is not causation. The maps have been criticized for selecting data that supports the theory while excluding cases that do not. Not every disappearance near a cave involves feral people. Many of these cases have mundane explanations, but the pattern exists. And when you layer in the physical evidence from cave surveys and the institutional pattern of sealing entrances after that evidence is reported, the coincidence becomes harder and harder to dismiss. And this is not just an Appalachian phenomenon. Let me take you west for a moment. In the Grand Canyon, an estimated 1,000 caves exist within the canyon walls. Only 335 have been recorded by the National Park Service. Fewer than a dozen have been fully explored. The vast majority are permanently closed to the public, and access is restricted even for credentialed researchers. The official reasons are the same ones you hear everywhere: protection of sensitive resources, structural safety, bat habitat. But there is a section of the Grand Canyon that deserves specific attention. The Hopi Salt Mines, extending from River Mile 62 to River Mile 62.5 on the southeast side of the Colorado River, have been closed to all public access for decades. The tunnel systems in that section are not natural caves. They are man-made, carved into the rock face by the Hopi and their ancestors. The Park Service manages them under the Federal Cave Resources Protection Act of 1988, which gives the government broad authority to restrict access to any underground feature on federal land. The Hopi themselves have said that those tunnels were not built for mining. They were built for hiding, and what they were hiding from has never been fully explained to outsiders. That leads me to something that I think is the most important dimension of this entire subject, and the part that nobody else in this space addresses with the seriousness it deserves. Across at least 6 distinct Native American cultural traditions, there are oral histories describing people who went wild. Not animals, not spirits, people. Human beings who entered the wilderness and underwent a transformation that made them something other than what they had been before they left. The Cherokee speak of a category of beings that is distinct from their spiritual traditions. Separate from the Nanahi, the immortal spirit people who live inside mountains, Cherokee oral history describes a different kind of presence. Humans who went into the mountains by choice or by force, and who were changed by the experience of sustained isolation. Elders in Western North Carolina have told stories about these individuals for generations. They describe people who lost the ability to speak, who moved through the forest at night, who took livestock from the edges of settled land. These are not mythological beings. These are people whose stories were preserved because the communities needed to remember the danger they represented. The Ute traditions from the Uinta Mountains describe beings called the Hungry Ones, who do not sleep. I have talked about this on this channel before. What I did not discuss in that video, and what I want to address now, is that some Ute elders distinguish between 2 categories within that tradition. One category describes something that may be genuinely non-human, something old and unknowable. But the second category describes people, human beings who were driven underground by conflict or by famine, and who survived by becoming something different. The elders do not confuse these 2 categories. They are very clear about the distinction. Some of the things in those mountains were never human, but some of them were, and those are the ones they warn about most urgently, because a human being who has lost everything that makes it human is more dangerous than any animal. The Shoshone, the Paiute, the Navajo, the Seminole. Different names, different languages, different geographies separated by thousands of miles. But the same core narrative repeated across all of them. People went underground, they survived, they changed, and they are still there. What is remarkable about this convergence is that these cultural traditions developed independently. These were societies with no contact with each other's oral histories, and yet they all describe the same phenomenon in the same terms. That kind of convergence does not happen around fiction. Fiction diverges. It fragments and distorts and evolves into something unrecognizable across cultures and centuries. Observed reality converges. When 6 independent cultures describe the same thing, the most parsimonious explanation is not that they all invented the same myth. The most parsimonious explanation is that they were all observing the same reality. And this is not confined to the past. Sightings of feral humans in the American wilderness are ongoing. In backcountry forums, in hunting communities, in caving circles, accounts surface regularly from people who describe encounters with individuals who appear human, but behave in ways that are deeply wrong. People moving on all fours at high speed through brush that would slow a normal hiker to a crawl. People who do not respond to language, who do not react to shouting or flashlights in any way that suggests they understand what those things are. People whose eyes reflect light in darkness, a phenomenon called eye shine, which in humans is associated with extreme long-term adaptation to low-light environments. I want to share one more account here. This one comes from a boar hunter I will call Marcus. He hunts at night in a remote section of the Ozark Mountains in southern Missouri, using thermal optics. He has been hunting that area for over a decade. One night in late fall of 2022, he picked up a heat signature near a limestone bluff about 2 miles from the nearest road. He expected a boar or a coyote. The signature was upright, bipedal, moving fast through heavy brush. He watched through the thermal scope as the figure dropped to all fours, covered another 50 yards in seconds, then stood upright again and disappeared into a gap in the bluff face. A cave entrance he had walked past dozens of times without ever noticing it. He went back the next morning. At the entrance he found animal bones, small game stripped and cracked for marrow, a crude tool made from sharpened antler, scratch marks on the rock at the lip of the entrance. He photographed everything and filed a report with the Missouri Department of Conservation. He never received a follow-up. When he returned 3 weeks later, the entrance had been fitted with a steel grate. A sign read, "Closed for habitat restoration." No agency contact information, no further explanation. I have heard some version of this story from people in West Virginia, in Kentucky, in the Ozarks, in Western North Carolina, in the Smokies. Different states, different agencies, different people reporting the evidence, but the same outcome every single time. The site is sealed, the data disappears, and nobody is ever told why. So we know where they are. We know what the evidence looks like. We know how the government responds when that evidence is found. But there is a question underneath all of this that I have been putting off, because honestly, it is the part that disturbs me the most. What have they become? Not who they were, not where they came from, but what happens to a human being, to a human body and a human mind, when it lives underground in total darkness for generations. And I have to be honest with you, the answer changed the way I think about this entire subject, because it does not require monsters. It does not require the supernatural. It only requires biology. And biology is relentless. There is a concept in developmental neuroscience called the critical period for language acquisition. The first years of a human life represent a window during which the brain is primed to absorb language. During this window, neural pathways form that will support speech, grammar, abstract thought, and the full range of social cognition that we associate with being a person. If that window closes without adequate language exposure, the ability to acquire language is permanently impaired, not delayed, not reduced, permanently and irreversibly lost. The neural pathways that would have supported speech are recruited by the brain for other functions: sensory processing, spatial awareness, the kind of heightened perception you would need to survive in an environment where language has no purpose. This is not theory. This is documented science based on real human cases. In 1800, a boy was discovered living alone in the forests of southern France. He was approximately 12 years old. He had no language, no social behavior, no apparent understanding of human interaction. He was given the name Victor of Aveyron. A physician named Jean-Marc Gaspard Itard spent 5 years working with Victor, attempting to teach him to speak and to function in human society. Despite intensive daily intervention by one of the most skilled doctors of the era, Victor never learned to speak more than a handful of words. He lived the rest of his life in institutional care. He died at approximately 40 years of age. The critical window had closed. The architecture for language had never been built. No amount of intervention could create what had never developed. In 1970, a 13-year-old girl was discovered in Los Angeles. She had been isolated in a single room for nearly her entire life by an abusive father. She could not speak. She could not walk normally. She had almost no understanding of social interaction. She was given the pseudonym Jeannie. After her rescue, teams of linguists and psychologists worked with her for years. She made some progress, learned some words, formed some basic sentences, but she never acquired functional language. Brain imaging revealed that the neural pathways, which should have supported speech, had been repurposed for sensory and spatial processing. The critical period had passed. The damage was permanent. Now apply that science to what we have been talking about. Think about it carefully. If families retreated into Appalachian cave systems during the Great Depression, their children would have had some language. Fragmentary, limited, degraded by the conditions of underground life, but present. Their grandchildren would have had less. Language requires consistent input and reinforcement. It requires social complexity. It requires context. In an environment where survival is the only priority and human interaction is limited to a handful of related individuals living in total darkness, language would erode with each generation. By the third generation, it would be almost gone. By the fourth, it would not exist at all. We are not talking about people who chose not to speak. We are talking about people whose brains developed without the neural architecture for speech. People for whom language is not a skill they lack. It is a capacity they were never equipped to develop. Their minds are not empty, they are full. But they are full of things we do not have words for, because our experience of the world is built on language in ways we rarely stop to consider. Spatial maps of tunnel systems memorized in total darkness. Auditory processing refined to the point where they can navigate by the echoes of their own breathing. Tactile sensitivity so acute that they can read the texture of cave walls the way you read a sentence on a page. Their brains work. They work extraordinarily well. But they work in a way that is fundamentally different from ours. And the cognitive changes are only half of it. The body adapts too. This is basic biology. Organisms that live in caves undergo predictable physical changes over generations. Loss of pigmentation, enhanced auditory and tactile sensitivity, altered retinal structure, and expanded pupil response. Changes in circadian rhythm and hormone production. In animals, these adaptations are well documented. Cavefish, cave salamanders, cave insects, all of them show the same patterns. There is no biological reason to believe that humans would be exempt. In documented studies on humans who have spent extended periods in total darkness, measurable physiological changes begin within weeks. Circadian rhythm collapses. Melatonin production shifts. Sensory thresholds drop as the brain reallocates processing power from vision to hearing and touch. These are temporary changes in people who spend weeks underground. In people who have lived there for decades, the changes would be profound. In people whose families have lived there for generations, the changes would be structural, written into the body by the same mechanisms of adaptation that shape every living organism on this planet. Enhanced night vision from permanently dilated pupils and altered retinal chemistry, skin that has lost pigmentation to the point of translucence, muscle development optimized for climbing and crawling rather than upright walking, altered bone density in the feet and hands from a lifetime of moving through confined stone passages, a diet of raw meat, cave-dwelling organisms, insects, and whatever can be caught near the surface during brief nocturnal forays would produce changes in dentition and jaw structure over generations. The teeth would narrow, the jaw would strengthen. The bite force would increase to accommodate raw food that is never cooked or processed. I want to be very careful about how I say this next part, because this is not about creating a monster. This is about understanding a consequence. If human beings have been living in American cave systems for 3 or 4 generations, then what exists in those caves today is a person who looks different from you, who moves differently from you, who perceives the world through senses that you barely use, who has no language, no concept of society, no framework for understanding what you are or what you want when you shine a headlamp into their home. They are biologically human. Genetically, they are no different from you or me. But the environment has shaped them into something that most people, encountering it in the darkness of a cave, would not immediately recognize as a fellow human being. And that is exactly what the eyewitness accounts describe. I think this is the real reason this subject stays buried. Not because the evidence is weak. The evidence is consistent and widespread. Not because the government does not know. The pattern of institutional response makes it clear that somebody, at some level of these agencies, knows exactly what is inside those cave systems. It stays buried because there is no good answer to the question it raises. What do you do about them? If these are human beings, and I believe the evidence says they are, then we have a responsibility to them. But what does that responsibility look like? You cannot rescue someone who has no concept of rescue. You cannot rehabilitate a mind that never developed the architecture for language or social cognition. Victor of Aveyron spent the rest of his life in an institution. Jeannie was eventually moved through a series of foster homes and disappeared from public record. The critical period research is unambiguous. After a certain point, the damage is not reversible. Not with therapy, not with technology, not with any intervention we currently possess. If there are 3rd or 4th generation feral humans living in American cave systems, the cave is not a prison to them. It is their entire world. It is the only reality they have ever known. Removing them from that environment would not save them. It would destroy the only existence they understand and place them in a world they have no capacity to navigate. And leaving them there means accepting that human beings, people who share our DNA, who are as human as you or I in every biological sense, are living in darkness and silence in conditions that most of us cannot imagine. That their great-grandparents made a choice or were forced into a circumstance that condemned every generation after them to a life that we would consider unthinkable. There is no clean resolution to that. There is no policy recommendation. There is no agency that is equipped to handle it. And I think that silence, that institutional paralysis, in the face of a problem that has no solution, is more honest than conspiracy. It is not a cover-up driven by malice. It is a silence driven by the simple, terrible fact that nobody knows what to do. I want to end with something that has stayed with me since I started working on this. After that cave in West Virginia was sealed, one of the survey team members went back to the site on his own. He did not try to enter. The entrance was gated and locked. He just sat outside about 20 feet from the steel grate as the sun went down. He waited for about 2 hours. The forest around him was quiet, normal quiet. Insects, wind through the canopy, the things you expect. Then, from deep inside the sealed passage, he heard something. A scratching against the steel, slow and deliberate. Then a sound, not a word, not quite an animal vocalization, something in between. A sound that a human throat would make if it had never learned to form words. It rose and fell in a rhythm that sounded intentional, like someone trying to communicate something they did not have the language to express. He recorded it on his phone. The recording is 4 minutes and 12 seconds long. He has never released it publicly. When I asked him why, he said he did not know what to do with it. He said it sounds like someone trying to say something they do not have the words to say, and he does not know who would listen. I do not know what is living in those caves. I do not know how many of them there are. I do not know how long they have been there, or how far the networks extend. But I know this: they are human. They were always human. And that is the most frightening thing about this entire story. Because it is not about monsters. It is about us. About what we become when we are forgotten. About what we become in the dark. If this video changed the way you think about what might be living beneath the trails you walk, comment the word caves below so I know who made it to the end. If you have not subscribed yet, please do. I will see you in the next one.